You have seen how the line was drawn.
Now watch what the line did to the people living on it. Peoples, identities older than the nation, kingdoms, one man, one morning, one pen.
There is a wound in West Africa that has never closed. It did not begin with a war, it began with a signature. On January 1st, 1914, a British man who had spent less than a decade in the region took a pen, signed a single document in a colonial office, and merged two territories that had never been one country, had never asked to be one country, and had almost nothing in common with each other, except that Britain found it cheaper to govern them as one. He called it Nigeria. He did not ask the Hausa. He did not ask the Yoruba. He did not ask the Igbo. He did not ask the Ijaw, the Tiv, the Efik, the Kanuri, the Ibibio, the Fulani, or any of the more than 250 ethnic nations whose land,
bound in
language,
unity,
and history were about to be folded into a single colonial filing cabinet. There was no referendum. There was no negotiation. There was no Nigerian in the room. What happened in the decades after that signature would include a military coup, a massacre remembered as a pogrom, a declaration of independence by a breakaway nation called Biafra, a civil war that starved over 1 million children to death, a 50-year silence enforced by the state that won, and finally, the rise of a man who would drag the entire unresolved wound back into the light. His name is Nnamdi Kanu. This is the story of how a line drawn by a man who barely knew the land became the deepest fracture in West Africa's history, and why, more than a century later, that fracture has never actually healed. It only went quiet. Part 1. The World Before the Line. To understand what was destroyed in 1914, you first have to understand what existed before it. Because the story Nigeria tells about itself, and the story the world was told about Africa, is that there was nothing here before the British arrived. No order, no civilization, no states worth respecting. That story is a lie. And it is worth taking the time to dismantle it properly, because everything that follows in this documentary only makes sense once you understand what was actually lost. The North. The Sokoto Caliphate. In the North, by the early 1800s, a religious scholar named Usman Dan Fodio had built something extraordinary. The Sokoto Caliphate. It was not a loose collection of villages. It was one of the largest states in Africa, governing an area larger than France, with a sophisticated Islamic legal system, a structured tax administration, formal education through Quranic schools, and a network of emirates that answered to a central authority in Sokoto. When the British arrived at the turn of the 20th century, they did not find chaos. They found a functioning empire. One organized enough that Frederick Lugard chose to rule through its existing emirs rather than replace them. The British called this indirect rule. In truth, it was an admission that the system already in place worked better than anything they could build from scratch. The Southwest, Yoruba city-states won. In the Southwest, the Yoruba had been building city-states for over 1,000 years. Ile-Ife was considered the spiritual birthplace of the Yoruba people, the place where, according to tradition, the world itself was created. Oyo had grown into a powerful empire with a sophisticated system of checks on royal power. The Oyo Messi Council could actually remove a king who abused his authority. This was constitutional governance, centuries before Britain ever used the term in reference to Africa. The Southeast, the Igbo, and the absence of kings. And then there was the Southeast, the Igbo heartland. And here is where the story becomes critical to everything that follows. Unlike the North and much of the West, the Igbo had no central king, no emperor, no single throne to negotiate with, conquer, or co-opt. Igbo society was organized around autonomous village democracies, councils of elders, title societies, and consensus-based decision-making spread across thousands of independent communities. There was no Igbo king, because the Igbo did not believe political power should be concentrated in one person at all. Authority was earned through age, wisdom, and community standing, not inherited through bloodline. This is not a minor cultural footnote. It is one of the most important facts for understanding everything that happens to the Igbo for the next 150 years. Because when the British came looking for kings to rule through, the way they had with the Sokoto emirs and the Yoruba obas, they could not find one in Igbo land. There wasn't one to find. So in 1929, British colonial officers did something that would have lasting consequences. They simply invented kings where none had existed. They appointed warrant chiefs, local men given artificial authority by British decree, accountable not to their communities, but to the colonial administration that created them. The Igbo did not accept this quietly. In December 1929, thousands of Igbo women marched on colonial offices across the southeast in what became known as the Women's War, Ogu Umunwanyi, protesting the imposition of these illegitimate chiefs and the taxation that came with them. British forces opened fire on the protesters. Over 50 women were killed. It was, in many ways, a preview of everything still to come. A people who governed themselves through consensus and dignity, being told by a foreign power that they would now be ruled by men who answered to London instead of to their own communities, and paying in blood for refusing to accept it quietly. 3 worlds, 1 future country. So by the early 1900s, what would later become Nigeria was not one place. It was 3 entirely distinct civilizational worlds, sitting side by side on the same landmass. A centralized Islamic caliphate in the north, with a structured emirate system built on religious law. A constitutional monarchy tradition in the southwest, with checks on royal power and deep spiritual cosmology, centered on Ile-Ife. And a stateless, egalitarian, consensus-driven democracy in the southeast, where authority was distributed rather than concentrated, and no single person had ever ruled the whole region, because no Igbo believed any single person should.
We must stand together.
These were not 3 provinces of an obvious future nation waiting to unite. These were 3 different civilizations who had developed, over 1,000 years, in almost total political independence from each other, connected by trade routes, but governed by fundamentally incompatible philosophies of power. And in 1914, a British administrator was about to decide that all 3 of them would now be governed as one. Not because they had anything in common, because it would save Britain money. Part 2. The signature. His name was Frederick Lugard. He arrived in West Africa with a military background, a reputation for ruthless efficiency in putting down resistance in other parts of the continent, and a clear set of instructions from London: make the colonies profitable and make them cheap to administer. By 1900, Britain was governing 2 separate territories in the region: the colony and protectorate of southern Nigeria, and the protectorate of northern Nigeria. They had separate administrations, separate budgets, separate legal systems, and, critically, separate financial situations. The South, with its access to the coast, its trade in palm oil, and its early exposure to missionary education, was generating a healthy revenue surplus. The North, vast and landlocked, with an economy still adjusting to British disruption of its existing trade networks, was running at a significant deficit. London's solution was simple, and it had almost nothing to do with culture, language, or the will of the people living there. Merge the 2. Let the southern surplus subsidize the northern deficit. Reduce the total number of British administrators needed. Cut costs. On January 1, 1914, Lugard signed the document that merged the northern and southern protectorates into a single political entity. He named it Nigeria, a name not of his own invention, but one suggested years earlier by his future wife, the journalist Flora Shaw, derived simply from the river Niger that ran through the territory. There was no consultation with traditional rulers. There was no meeting of northern, western, and eastern leaders to discuss terms. There was no vote, no referendum, no gathering of any kind in which the people who would now share one nationality were asked whether they wanted to. Lugard's own later writings make the administrative logic explicit. He described the amalgamation in terms of financial efficiency and administrative convenience, not cultural unity, not shared destiny, not nation-building in any meaningful sense. He was not building a country. He was consolidating an accounting ledger, a marriage without a wedding. It is worth pausing here on what this actually meant on the ground, because the abstraction of amalgamation hides the lived reality of what was done. Overnight, on paper, a Hausa farmer in Kano and an Igbo trader in Onitsha
This one
became
is fresh
citizens of the
today.
same political entity,
How about two for
despite
that
speaking
price?
no common language, sharing no common religion, having no common legal tradition, and having essentially no history of unified governance between them. A Yoruba Oba in Ibadan, ruling under centuries of established constitutional tradition, was now nominally part of the same colonial structure as a Tiv community in the Middle Belt that had never been ruled by a king at all.
This was the dynamic that shaped the future. The cane tree.
You have seen how the line was drawn.
Now watch what the line did to the people living on it.